I'm Nadine, and yes, I have to apologize for what might prove to be an Eeyore moment in our conversations today, because I do bring with me a little bit of experience of challenge, learning to expect the unexpected and work out what to do about it. By way of introduction, somewhere in all the events of the last 20 months, I forgot to remember that I've spent 25 years in circuit ministry, and in that time I've bumped into community centres, preschools, toddler groups, different projects intended to help us to develop our communities. In those 25 years, I've also worked as an adult leadership development coordinator in a uniformed organisation, and with my husband, have run a hospitality business in the United States. It was a bakery cum cafe, and we developed it into a community cafe where we were able to support ex-offenders. We were able to support older employees in the hospitality industry, because we wanted to make space for people who might have been marginalized in the employment sector. So it's with that hat on that I talk about some of the difficulties, and I suppose the latest challenge can be summed up by saying that Parchmore Methodist Church and Community Centre works very closely in partnership with Croydon Council. And you would have heard through the media that Croydon Council issued a Section 21 notice, which meant that it was not undertaking any new expenditure. And as a partner of the council, we were desperately worried about what implications that would have for our work. Funding was cut, staff was removed from all the outreach services, and our development plan at Parchmore was left in pieces. So this is what we've been working through. So when I reflect on all of that, where does one turn? And I think my church councils will not be surprised to hear me say this morning, remember the words in Luke's Gospel where Jesus talks about the cost of discipleship. For which of you, intending to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? That has a lot to say about sustainable governance and mission, but it also has something to say about our own resilience, the resilience of our churches, our projects, whether they're enormous projects or just smaller groups and activities that are quite dear to members of our churches and our communities. Building resilience into what we do is probably even more important now than it was before the pandemic, because we face a great deal of uncertainty. There is the very human uncertainty of not knowing what's coming next, but there is also economic uncertainty, socioeconomic uncertainty, and our dreams, our hopes, our projects will need to be able to respond, especially because it might take some of them just a little longer to come to fruition. So what I thought I'd do with this morning is just to share with you what I call a starter tool for integrated praxis. So I'm going to share my screen and then explain what I'm on about. All right. Integrated praxis. It's a very fancy phrase for something that I think we all do when we plan a mission project or a development project. Whether we're actually aware we're doing it or not is what's important. We generally spend a lot of time working out the reasons why we do what we do. All this tool is inviting us to be aware of is the original reasons, all of them in their complexity, and it invites us to keep going back to all of all of the motivations, all of the excitement, all of the inspiration for what we're doing. So this tool, in its flowery form, has 6 components that are worth thinking about when we put our plans for mission together. None of the 6 components are more important than the others. There's no significance to the order in which they appear. But what's really important to note is that these components are all dynamic. It means they're always interacting with each other, influencing each other. They're always changing the core of what we're doing. And the reason that's important is because none of the projects that we engage in are static. The people with whom we work change, our circumstances change, things can literally change on a daily basis. So this diagram, this model is intended to help us, to remind us to look at that and then to work out how we cope with that. So I'm going to take a very brief and what I hope will be a practical look at all of these 6 contributors to why we do what we do. The very first component invites us to read our churches. Now, I think in some ways this is self-evident, but as Dawn has already mentioned, we need to remember that church members do have an interest in church property, in what it looks like, what it feels like to be there, what they've put into the property over the years. And they also have an interest in the projects which we undertake. And that's true even when we're struggling to take ownership of all the responsibilities, and we know what they are, all those responsibilities that come with managing church property, using church property for other projects. So it's critical to spend time understanding and talking and working with church members to determine how they respond to all the hopes that we might have for a property. Not everyone is going to agree with every detail of all those hopes. And so a very important role for those of us in leadership is to remember that we need to facilitate consensus. We're not trying to work out whether people agree or disagree with what we're doing. We are trying to get consensus for that mission plan, which connectionally we're invited to embark on. Something else to remember is that it's those very church members who will turn up, who will turn out to help us when we promote projects, when we advertise projects to partners. At Parchmore, we would not have been able to engage some of our new partners. We would not have been able to launch some of our new mission projects if it wasn't for the ordinary church members who provided hospitality in the way in which they always did, but managed to wow all our guests. It's also really important that we read our churches regularly because our membership changes. And as we're all painfully aware, our membership also declines. And that means that the impetus that people might have had 5 years ago for engaging with something might not be the reasons people would have for engaging now. And I think we also need to be honest about the fact that sometimes the reason for undertaking a project, it might have been a luncheon club, it might have been a youth club, some of those reasons go away altogether. Also, if we fail to read how people are feeling about what's happening on the property or how projects are managed, we may open the door to additional conflict. Might find that church members do have hopes or ideas about what might happen on church premises, and they're not really being awkward. They just they've come across something in another circuit, or they've seen another charity do something and they'd like to have a go. And they need space and they need time. So read a congregation because there might be a new vision emerging, a more contemporary vision. There may be fewer of those amazingly hospitable people around, but there might also be church members who want to engage with people through marketing or social media. Why we do what we do does need to be informed by stakeholders in our faith communities. Dawn's also reminded us again about reading our context. That's another component that we regularly need to engage in when we figure out why we do what we do. What about our neighbours? Who lives next door? Who's operating the parade of shops across the street? It's really interesting to hear the conversation about church coffee shops. I wonder whether we find out from local business owners how they feel about having yet another coffee shop on their street. It's not a criticism of coffee shops. It's a question about how we work in partnership to build the fabric of our communities. How much competition do we create that eventually impacts our neighbours? What do we do when both the houses and the local businesses are empty? What does that tell us about who's around? More deeply, what is the social demographic of our neighbourhood? Are our neighbours older or younger? What are their socioeconomic needs? We might have a lovely plan for a really sophisticated group which doesn't begin to touch the ordinary conversations that people around us are having. What does census data tells us? What are the problems that the local authorities are concerned about, in which they have no obvious facility to address? Can we or can't we help? Which construction projects are important to local development plans? Is it housing, or is it commercial space, or is it community space? Is there a demand for social housing or a community land trust? Or is there in fact serious local opposition to new developments? Are there too many homes of multiple occupancy, which means that a property development project isn't likely to gain planning permission? Is someone else already doing what you're planning? What is the local community Facebook page worried about? I think that part of that conversation is self-evident to all of us. What is harder to determine and harder to read is how quickly all of those things change. There are trends in community development. In the last 5 years, our local area has moved from deep concern for older people to facing gun and knife crime, and so a lot of weight, a lot of funding has been shifted from the other things that the local authority was doing and local partners were doing into that area of concern. Trends change, and rightly so. But how does that change the amount of interest your community is taking in what you do, and what funding is available for your project? And we need to remember that as the funding changes, so our liabilities are affected. So Parchmore Community Centre has for a long time delivered services for older people. But in the last decade, that funding has been cut by 2/3 because the needs of the local community has changed. So all the liabilities that the community centre had were impacted by this reduced funding, and that's forced some very painful decisions. We read our neighbourhood, we read our congregations, and always, again, as Dawn has said, always with a view to building relationships. So in spite of the downsides of working in partnership with people, at the moment in community development, there is a far greater concentration of services that are delivered for people through local hubs. So here is an extraordinary opportunity to explore who the organizations might be with whom our churches and our projects would like to establish either a formal or informal partnership working. So if you want to gather a group of people in a sociable space and you're looking for something that might draw people in, it could be worth looking at, for example, the reader group. These are trained volunteers who work in schools and in local small groups to help people to engage with stories. They're highly trained, they read poetry, they read classical literature, they read contemporary work, and they get people talking around books, around thoughts and ideas. And that might be the activity that stimulates your community cafe. That's a small organization. There might be far larger charitable organizations that can help you. Is there an umbrella organization like Age UK or your local voluntary services, of which you might become a part, that will put you in touch with new opportunities that will strengthen your project? Could you support your local GP in social prescribing? Is there an organization which would like to lease space or use space under license, and make sure that you're aware of the differences? Is there a group with whom you might barter? Could you use a partnership agreement to offer them a presence in your buildings, as long as they pay less, but also will help you add to the kind of service you want to strengthen? All these partnerships work with ecumenical partners, user groups in your own building who are already there, local charities. All of these have a role to play in working out what is a good, financially sustainable, attractive mix for your vision. And again, it's important to recognize that we can't do everything, but if we can be known locally for doing something well, you could become your social services go-to partner for work with older people. Social services need someone to whom they can refer the people whom they feel are falling between the cracks. Potentially your lunch club and your coffee morning and your partnership with Age UK could help you to become that centre of excellence locally. The next topic, the very important but potentially least glamorous of all considerations in working out why we do what we do, is the need to follow the rules. So if you're renting out accommodation at the moment, I need to ask, have you appointed an electrical contractor to complete an EICR? Because the law changed, and from the 1st of April 2021, every private tenant has a right to occupy a property as their only or their main residence and pays rent. If they're allowed to do that in your property, you need to prove to them that your electrics are safe. That changed in the midst of the pandemic, came into effect in June last year, and is a perfect illustration of the kind of legal change which we need to be on top of. So whether we're renting out flats for accommodation, whether we are needing to stay on top of safeguarding rules, it's really important that we measure the sustainability of our projects and our properties in terms of our ability to abide by the law. Sadly, in my recent experience, there was a rental property involved and it wasn't managed well. A month into my appointment, I was asked for help with the situation that developed. And for the last 3 years, we've been fighting to keep a situation for which the church is partly liable out of the courts. I'm pleased to say it's all been resolved. But that's what happens when we don't manage to stay on top of all the changes, the legal changes. I can still remember at the advent of Ofsted inspections of preschools and all the policy documents and all the job descriptions that had to be written. Things change quickly in the legal environment, and we have to be assured that whatever we're doing, we're able to respond to those changes quickly. Are your fixed-term employment contracts, for example, sufficiently robust to cope with grievances or changes in parental leave? When last did you review your project's financial controls? Funders are interested in those controls. The Charity Commission asks us that question every year. Have you done that review? Sometimes things can go wrong. More often, situations just become a little chaotic and we lose control of a bank account because all the signatories have moved on. Are we equipped to recover the money in that account? Are we aware that that kind of thing can happen? Are we keeping an eye? More importantly, financial management does have something to say about why we do what we do. Actually, it says, can we afford to do what we're doing at the moment? So are the accounts for your project a class of your local church or your circuit's accounts, so that when you do your monthly management accounts, the questions you have about funding are available? And in most cases, we can't wait for quarterly accounts. You need a monthly management account to work out whether you can still afford to do what you do. And we get asked what feels like an incredibly annoying question about the state of our reserves policy. I suspect those of us working in projects have come to value any work that was put into putting our reserve policies in place in the last 20 months. That reserve policy is what helps us to understand when we make the decisions about dealing with our financial liabilities. Do you know, for example, what it might cost to make your employees redundant? That's why so many of the rules, the guidance, the policies that we're asked to follow are important. They're hard, they take work, they take expertise that we don't always feel we have, but they help. They help us to go back and say, why are we doing this? Can we still do this? Again, something that Dawn has touched on. Churches can no longer assume that we are benefactors in mission. At best, we can only work with people. Most of the knowledge that we require to plan, to deliver mission effectively, really resides beyond the church. And I think we know that already. But potentially we need to remind ourselves to turn to people who have expert knowledge, to listen to their advice, to learn from their experience. So do we need to seek employment advice from an HR professional? Just ask someone who works in a consultancy role to cast an eye over contracts. Do we need to spend time working in another church or a charity that's really experienced in delivering the service that we have to offer? Dawn was talking about having referred to, in conversations about their cafe, another church doing the same. There's nothing to be lost in learning. Do we need to attend seminars, for example, to learn about the definitions of food poverty and homelessness prevention? Something really interesting happened during the pandemic here in Thornton Heath. There were only 2 local food providers at the start of the pandemic, and we were stretched in terms of finding innovative, consistent food supplies and making sure that people could get to us. By the end of the pandemic, it turns out that Thornton Heath now has 9 food providers. And the question one needs to ask is, in the zeal to do what we need to do to help our community, can we sustain that many small food providers? What impact does it have on the others? And are we really still tackling food poverty? It's an important question because there's a difference between making food available and helping people to move beyond just needing the food to finding more permanent, more resilient solutions for themselves. So I'm not knocking food banks that help, but what is food poverty? How long does it last? How does it contribute to homelessness in our area? It's worth taking the time to spend with experts to understand what it is that we're actually trying to help with. More practically, do we need to appoint a managing agent for church rental properties? Because, goodness, how do we stay on top of all the changes in tenancy agreements? I think we need to be sure that we're not just trying to do good. Our services need to be of a high standard. Our efforts need to be believable because they do really impact people's lives. At best, they can make enormous changes. At worst, they can do real damage. So I'm going to go back to the little picture because I want to turn to this question of review. We do know all of these things. We do practice them all in some way. It's helpful to know that it needs to be done often. But they're also important because this is the only way in which we're going to work out what is changing around us. There might be really exciting new developments in the area which interests us, in the sphere which we're trying to influence. That's going to change why we do what we do. There might be a whole new set of governance questions that need to be answered. That could affect why we do what we want to do. Someone might have a new vision. That vision might come from outside the church or from within. Or someone might have spoken with us about new limitations to what we do. This is how we work out whether we can cope with a change, how resilient we are. And this brings me to a final consideration. Mission plans or projects can always evolve healthily and sustainably, but very sadly, none of them last forever. There is a value in knowing when to stop. And I say that as a person who's been involved in the closure of preschools, not because people have lost the heart, but because the size of the project just overtook the very small number of church members who were left to deal with it. Sometimes review is our key to knowing when to stop trying to save a project or a building. And those reasoned statements, those clearly worked out motivations are important in the question of endings. Because pastorally one can avert a great deal of guilt, a great deal of embarrassment, a great deal of pain, if we understand why something's not working. I think we need to remember that endings take a lot of time and a lot of energy in themselves. Closing something in time might mean that your financial liabilities end while you can still control them, instead of ending when you're forced to draw a line under something. It's always worth avoiding debt and bankruptcy that's brought on by sudden changes like the pandemic, because it takes emotional energy, it takes resourcefulness, it takes determination, it takes perspective, it takes hope to end things well. And if we leave things too late, that energy is only going to be drained by the shock and the grief of something we're forced to do. Stopping something early might well mean that we have enough hope and enough resilience left to try again on a smaller scale, to respond to a different kind of need. Just taking time to think, to get some perspective, requires perseverance. And for that, we need a bit of emotional energy and a bit of physical energy. So I'm offering this tool as a way to say, here's a way of keeping looking at what's going on, so that in time you can make the really positive decisions, because there are loads of opportunities out there, but you can also make the really difficult decisions. It is with extraordinary sadness that the 52-year community development project at Parchmore has now come to a close. There's a great deal of shared grief involved in that, but we have a much smaller, much less able congregation with many more financial limitations to deal with. And I suppose as I look back on the last 20 months, the one thing that gives me some comfort is that in time, our church council was able to make hard decisions, because in all of the last 4 years, we were on top of our liabilities, on top of our responsibilities, and brave enough to do difficult things. So it is with some new hope that I look forward, and would encourage you to look forward, but also want to say, with as much sensitivity as I can, it's okay when the energy runs out. It's hard, but let's give ourselves as churches time and space to be honest, to be candid, so that there's enough left to look into the future. I think that's enough from me for now. I can stop being Eeyore for a bit.
Thank you so much, Nadine. I think what we got here is, so we started on a high of everything you can do, and now we've been brought some questions, probing questions that give us the reality of how things can go. So we're not just going to jump into things because they sound amazing, because some of the things we can do are amazing. But as Nadine has said, have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? Now, we are running behind, but not that we will end later than the projected time. So I want to give, if there are any questions, just a few minutes for those before we I have a little break. So if there's anyone with a question, although really Nadine has posed a question to us, please raise your hand. There's a hand there, and it is Andrew Letby.
Thank you, and thank you, Nadine, for your practical wisdom as ever. You used a phrase that really struck me quite early on in your presentation about amazing hospitality, and I wonder whether you could offer some practical or some examples of how congregations have offered that amazing hospitality. You know exactly what you meant by that, and I think sort of leading on from that, any strategies that you might have for engaging congregation members to develop a vision and to run with it that doesn't rely entirely on the minister having an idea and putting it into practice, but there's sort of getting that real sort of engagement. I can see you smiling there, but we've probably had this conversation many times.
Thanks, Andrew. When it comes to hospitality, I think what we need to do is to recognize that people have a lot to give, as long as we ask them to give what they have a capacity to share. That sounds obvious, but I think sometimes we can ask our congregations for too much. So we talk to our congregations about what they're really good at doing, and hospitality, whether it's serving food or helping people to feel welcome, goes a long way if we encourage people to do it their way. So in terms of amazing hospitality, I think the first thing I would say is ask your congregation for help, ask people around you to do things, but allow them to do it their way, and they will always surprise you. What we were able to do in terms of offering hospitality with church members, and this is an older congregation now in their 70s and 80s, was we were able to tack that hospitality onto the big lunch. So if you're aware of the Eden Project community, you'll be aware that they encourage the big lunch. And here in Croydon, the big lunch was something that was recognized by the local authority as a way to develop communities. And so they would close the roads around us for free. So yes, we thought we might like to have a street party at some point, but when we heard about the big lunch and the free road closure, because there's no way we could pay £350 to close a local road, we jumped on the bandwagon. We used their publicity, but we added it to the things that we were wanting to profile for the local community. So we ate lunch on the street, but in 1 year we invited all our user groups to host a table in the local the church and the community space upstairs and downstairs. And we said, just tell people about who you are and what you do. And we mingled that with children's activities. So in effect, someone else was doing all the publicity for us, all the marketing, and we asked our church members, could you bring food? Interestingly, in the first year, for our lunch club members who came to the big lunch, we cooked the food that they were used to. We discovered in the second year in which we did this that actually they didn't want the food they were used to eating. They were really much more interested in the food that church members were bringing. And so year 2 of this phase of the project was helping with more community cohesion than we would have achieved in our first year. So that's just an example of our local hospitality. When it comes to how we engage church members, I was very fortunate a long time ago to serve alongside a lay worker who said that often when we're trying to get people on board with what we're doing, we need to work out how to make it smell as though some good bread is baking. And you know, there's so much truth in that. Who doesn't like to walk past a bakery and smell something good? More often than not, we need to give people an example of what we'd like to achieve. Try something out and invite people to be part of it. Not everybody knows what it is that we're aiming for. Not everybody's been exposed to what we want to try. So have a go. And if nobody likes it, well, we've all heard the phrase, it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. And if you know your congregation and your community well, you'll sort of half understand what they'll like, and you'll know which risks you are taking. So try something. People will either join in and they won't. That way you'll know whether they're willing to go with us or not. And I think most people, if you can show them something practical, feel far better able to respond to what you're doing than if you put the theory and the words across. I'm not a great fan, I have to be honest, of mission statements and vision statements. I'm far more practical. Before I trained for the ministry, I was training as a graduate chemical engineer. It's a whole lot easier to show somebody how to do something in an experiment than to teach them beforehand with all the theory and the statistics. So that would be my approach, and I hope it helps.
Thank you.
Nadine.
You didn't have a follow-up question?
No, that's fine. No, that's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question before we go on a break, and that's from Sally.
It's not really a question, a comment, because what I'm hearing, I can see a link between what's been said so far. And Nigel's comment that context is important, and that really struck me when he said it, because I'm from the Chester and Stoke-on-Trent district, and our context is vastly different from yours. And the recent change in the minimum number of members to be a viable church is greatly impacting us because we have so many small rural churches. So that's forcing us to look at the future of many of our properties. And Dawn's comments about funding also really struck me. And I used to be very much against the idea of employing an organisation to do your funding for you, because back in a former life, I'm a quantity surveyor. I haven't worked in quantity surveying for a long time, but when the church found this out back in the beginning of 2016, I was asked to help with some fundraising, the assumption being I was good with numbers. I did prove to be quite good at it for one project, which I then went on to project manage. By the end of 2016, I was employed by the circuit as a lay worker to keep repeating this with churches. It becomes, the idea being that I was a cheaper option than a firm. We thought this was a good idea at the time, but as time's moved on, we found that it causes more problems than it helps, because the churches were relying too much on someone does it for you, which is kind of linking back to another comment that's been made. And I know it was about community, not churches, but it's not doing things for, but doing things with. So now we're looking at maybe not doing things for the churches, but enabling them to do their fundraising. I have a wealth of knowledge on how to do it now and the contacts. So the plan going forward is for me to enable folk within the church to do it for themselves and to have ownership of their fundraising, which then takes me back that sustainability which Nadine's been talking about. So I'm sorry I've got my bit to do yet, but I just wanted to rattle on, and I can see a flow going through this, and it's all resonating. So
fabulous. Thank you for that, Sally.